Okay, welcome everybody to LEEDS Theosophical Society and our latest Zoom presentation, which we've been doing now for almost 5 years. And this afternoon we have one of our interviews stroke conversations with a very, very interesting person whom I've had very close dealings with over the last couple of years. For those of you who don't know Edi Bilimoria, and I'm sure most of you do, let me just say that he's a modern day polymath. He's a scientist, a mathematician, a musician, glider pilot, and many, many other things as well. He's worked on some of the key projects in Britain over the last few years, including warships, the Channel Tunnel, and numerous other things as well. But I think his most important work over the last 20 years, which this is what this project has taken, 20 years of research to produce his monumental book, Unfolding Consciousness, which weighing 5 kilos and costing nearly £100 is an absolutely incredible work. And I've become very familiar with this work, having produced various abbreviated forms of it. And the most abbreviated form of this has been to reduce 770,000 words, which makes it longer than the Secret Doctrine and the Bible, down to around 75,000 words. And it's going to be published in this form sometime, I think, around December in a paperback book. The idea was to make what are often very complex and technical and mathematical ideas available to a wider general audience. And this book is so important because it's the most important book written about consciousness, in my opinion, for many decades. So welcome, Edi, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Let's just start with the basics. What actually prompted you to start work on this incredible and detailed book 20 years ago? Was there some spark of inspiration, or was it more of a slow burn?
Yeah. Let me start, Tim, with a preamble first, and I will certainly answer your question. Thank you for mentioning Atma. He was a very dedicated and a very humble and inquiring member of the Theosophical Society. And I just thought I'd explain why I put the picture behind me, the Golden Gate Bridge, because, excuse my rather cynical sense of humor, America's having a bit of a hard time. And I do want to point out there's some beautiful places in America. And Sausalito and San Francisco are just two of such places. But now to come back to your question, Tim, why does one fall in love? It could be a spark of inspiration, it could be meeting someone, or it could be a gnawing feeling within oneself to say something. In the same way as a musical composer would compose sometimes his greatest works with no commission, with no reason other than the fact that he just loved doing it. I mean, Schubert's just one example. So love of the subject is one, but the other reason is I can only refer to as massive irritation. Irritation with the rather, sorry to put it this way, the rather fundamentalist attitudes in the Theosophical Society, where the international rules state quite clearly freedom of thought, freedom of society, and this whole thing of dogmatizing Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, which has nothing to do with reverence, dogmatizing the principles of man, fixed ideas, and I really wanted to broaden out that narrow perspective and show in Blavatsky's own terms, her own words, that these various streams of wisdom, whether from science, religion, or philosophy, or wherever, can be taken back to their source in the ancient wisdom. So if I can possibly identify just three key factors or key things that I was aiming at all the time was, as I said, to show that science, religion, philosophy can be subsumed under the one overarching term, the perennial philosophy. And then to show how all the mystery teachings of all ages and all cultures are really united in their central message, even though the way of expressing it was very different. And thirdly, to show that all these conundrums in science can be not solved but resolved by recourse to the mystery teachings. And that was really the thrust of my second book, The Snake and the Rope. So those were the overriding reasons. And to show that consciousness comes first. We don't have
the book doesn't only challenge the back to Blavatsky view and, pickle her wisdom in aspic kind of approach to things, but it's also a huge challenge to conventional materialistic science, as you call it, the religion of scientism, because, as you elaborate in your book, they can't define consciousness other than some kind of epiphenomenon of electromechanical activity in the brain. Without a brain, for science, there is no consciousness. And I think this is perhaps, having read the book many times, this is the core message which I take away from it.
Well, you certainly displayed right away, Tim, that you have read the book many times and the way you summarized its essential message so well. And despite trying one's best to show that the very fundamental ground of our being is not physical matters, a lot of science would have it, but consciousness. It is very paradoxical that whereas science, particularly quantum physics, of course, has demonstrated with such rigorous theory and impressive experiments that at the deepest, most fundamental level, we are all interconnected, we are all entangled. And science has shown this almost without argument, despite the fact that the whole globe is united digitally and electronically. Despite that, it is so sad, paradoxically, yet, to see the consciousness of nations so utterly sectarian and selfish in their thinking, with no understanding of the interconnection. And, my gosh, one can think of Gaza, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen, and now the latest standoff between India and Pakistan. And what a sickening thing to say. Not one drop of water will now go to Pakistan. This is the Indus River system. So because of a terrorist attack, we're going to deprive our neighbor, whom we are meant to love like ourselves, but we don't. We're going to deprive them of water by silting the Indus River system. Just think what that means. And there are major plans to do this as a revenge attack. There's revenge attacks all over the world. So sadly, in one sense, we are seeing how science and enlightened people are showing the entanglement and interconnection in the world, and yet the nations and their leaders, God bless their selfish hearts, are just way away from this fundamental precept. And that's paradoxical and quite despairing, actually.
Well, it is when you think that there are more than 100 wars taking place on this planet at the moment, and there is an annual defense spending of something around $3 trillion.
Yes.
And people complain that spending $10 billion on the James Webb Telescope, for example, is a waste of money. But spending all this money on munitions is a good idea. It provides jobs, etc., etc. And certainly, I think, one of the things which is very, very important here is that our leaders, by and large, don't have a spiritual bone in their bodies, most of them. None of them. And this is the problem. And this also, I believe, has led to a complete disconnect between the political classes and the people they serve, not rule, serve. And this is happening not only in the UK, but many, many other countries. I go to Greece a lot, and the situation is exactly the same there. The polarization between the people and the political elite. So this idea that there is any kind of spiritual dimension to politics is a non-starter at the moment, but it will have to happen in some way. And in fact, we're going to be talking about this in future Zooms here. Can I ask you about science's attitudes and whether you think, I've asked you this question before, so forgive me, but do you detect any shift in the rather obdurate attitudes of mainstream science? Are there some dissidents? Are there people who are forming the basis of a scientific revolution of enlightenment?
That's a question one needs to keep revisiting, Tim. That's very important. And one first recalls the legendary saying, of course, in the Mahatma letters, science is our best ally. But one also forgets the second half of that statement, but the very science is still the weapon that is used to break our heads with. So one detects, certainly I do, a definite bifurcation. If we just deal with the breaking our heads with first, in terms of what I see is the misuse and the sheer abuse of science, for example, genetic engineering, artificially manipulating through hormones and all a pig's liver for organ transplant. The other one, which I find rather sickening, is this obsession to create a woolly mammoth, because the mammoths were in the Ice Age. But now they've really created a woolly mouse, and there's a picture of it. It's not fantasy. By modifying DNA, they've created a woolly mouse in order to then create a woolly mammoth. And this is a crass abuse of nature's laws, which will have obviously, its serious consequences. Then the other one is transhumanism, which we needn't labor the point on that one, the manipulation of the human being using microchips and genetic material. And then the total plundering of the earth. But on the much brighter side, yes, I do see much optimism. Now, what I see, Tim, is not so much that science is corroborating some of the more specific tenets of the ancient wisdom, but rather than there is a huge movement in science that is breaking down materialism as the foundation and bedrock of the scientific worldview. Now, you can't progress with uniting or converging science with spirituality before you break down its foundations. And then when you break down the foundations, then Theosophy can peep through the cracks. So the breakdown is very, very obvious now in many ways. Firstly, this never-ending talk of life on other planets. Ages ago, Fred Hoyle mentioned the idea of panspermia, the idea of viruses and germs from outer space seeding nascent humanity. Well, yeah, okay. But now they found strong evidence of what they'd like to say alien life on planet K2b outside the solar system. So at one time, the idea of life in the outer universe was nonsense. Then the idea was the statistical probability. There's so many galaxies, there must be. Now they're finding evidence of molecules that they thought could only exist on Earth. But the whole approach is looking at life in physical biological terms, and this is the difference. The NASA definition of life is only that which is amenable to Darwinian evolution as we know on Earth. Whereas that famous saying of Blavatsky is that just because we cannot see life in the outer universe, we have no right to say it doesn't exist. And occult science deals with universals and not the particulars. But at least the movement is towards acknowledging, not just debating, acknowledging that life could exist outside the universe. Then the whole question of evolution, where at one time the route from Neanderthal to man was supposed to be a direct route. Now there's plenty of evidence of interbreeding reminiscent of the accounts we hear in the about the third root race. In cosmology, at one time, the mechanical universe based on Newton's principles was gospel. Now that is rubbish. Where is it? This is one of the most wonderful books, Paradise Is Now, which I'm reviewing. It's had a commendation from a Nobel physicist that shows explicitly that Newton encoded his entire Principia based on the ancient wisdom. So that's certainly hopefully going to break down, clockwork universe. The other thing we're finding in science is an open discussion on UAPs now.
Yes. Yeah.
So all of this is breaking down materialism.
I think one of the groups that I've become very interested in over the years, and they've been going for more than 50 years now, and you'll be well aware of them, is the Institute of Noetic Sciences in America, formed by, among other people, Edgar Mitchell, one of the astronauts of the 1970s. And he had a very profound experience during his time in space. And what they do, of course, is try to investigate the interconnectivity of all things and how things exist on a non-material level. They look at things like precognition, telepathy, telekinesis, and numerous other things as well, and are doing it in a very, very scientific way. I think their work is very important, and they have such high caliber people working for them. I would hope that they would be able to influence, wider sections of the scientific community. Do you think that's possible?
Well, they have Dean Radin for a start, and many other very influential people. It is a slow feed, I think. It is inevitable that the bow wave will break over the dam at some stage. But then on the more depressing side, the very well-known Templeton Foundation are still obsessed with this idea that the brain generates consciousness and pouring millions into experiments that would demonstrate this. So I would say there's still a lot of inroads that have to be made, because this whole thing is tied up with money, prestige, Nobel Prizes. Truth doesn't really figure. The impartial, unconditional investigation of truth is subservient to wanting your name on the latest academic paper to get a Nobel Prize. And more than once I heard Ravi Ravindra say that he once, in Princeton, he suggested to a few of the top scientists whether they would like to go on a 1 week Zen meditation course, and not one was interested. And moreover, that scientists or researchers from one laboratory were not talking to the other laboratories because both people wanted a Nobel Prize, and obviously you don't communicate your secrets. So given the jealousies and the antagonisms, the top level message always to get across is, without a radical refinement of the human character, everything else is not a waste of time, but everything else is a product of who you are.
Yeah, it seems to be all about reputation and hubris and money, and also, just your academic reputation may be at risk if you start to put around certain ideas. We've seen this not in the spiritual field, but in the political field so much with cancellation culture and everything. So this hive mind approach of science has to change, doesn't it? It has to change.
Well, it can only change, well, for a start, if there were a major disaster, and I've no idea what. But I've often thought if one really senior scientist were to have a radical U-turn in his thinking, would that make a difference? And I was thinking if Richard Dawkins suddenly had an NDE and that epiphany really, he changed his mind completely in the way like Gilbert Taylor and Ibn Alexander. And I think it would not, Tim. I'll tell you why. Because the other side would say, oh, well, he was deprived of oxygen in his brain. He was hallucinating. As Arthur Ellison, who we loved so much in the TS many years ago, said the fortress of materialism is well nigh impregnable. So the clever thing to do is not to adopt the Bastille approach and try and blast it down, but if you can take one roof tile off the fortress, just take one roof tile out and let the gale of public opinion blow the roof off. And that's using a more energy efficient way than trying to blast the fortress.
I think one of the problems here, of course, is that culturally and socially and in our everyday lives, we worship science. It has become a religion. And, its close cousin technology dominates all our lives. And we say this many times, the technology itself is neutral. It's how we apply that technology. And, I think the fact that we can all gather here today from numerous different places is fantastic. But at the same time, the same technology is being used to manipulate people's minds. It's being used to control people. It's being used to spy on them. And it's being used for all sorts of other nefarious purposes as well. So science does have a certain amount of blood on its hands because it will invent things and release them for commercial or military use without thinking for a moment of the wider implications of these things. And this is what's happened, I think, with, these poisonous things, or things that have become poisonous, like social media. Something that was meant to be a communication tool has often become a means of alienation and attack now. And this is a strange paradox, but a very good illustration of the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, and all an outcome and product of the human nature.
Okay, so next question, how do we change human nature, Eddie?
Oh, gosh. Not by preaching the secret doctrine to everyone. Really, by, in every way, by all manner of means, trying to inculcate some understanding of karma. And because people are most motivated by what fills their pockets and what is best for themselves, which is understandable, to show that more understanding of karma really would help you as an individual. It would help your health, your family, and your pocket. If you work with this law in a wise way.
And of course, Madame Blavatsky said that this was the law of laws. This was the most important thing to understand. And also, if you adopt and appreciate and cooperate with the law of karma, if you understand it, then de facto it means that you believe you have a soul. And it's my belief that this is humanity's fundamental problem. It's identity crisis, the fact that so many people A, don't know they have a soul, and B, if they do, are not connected with
Or
it.
disconnected, yeah.
And making that soul connection is such an important thing for people to do. And in fact, it's probably the most important thing any of us do in any one life, isn't it?
Absolutely, Tim, yes. And just a quick rejoinder is also in talking about karma, never to get across an idea that if difficulties come your way, it's to punish you. Not at all. Difficulties, when one is progressing, alas and sadly, are not because you were a naughty boy or a naughty girl who hurt someone else in a former life. Not at all. The difficulties are obstacles that you surmount in order that you can grow in your strength, which is a hard lesson, of course. But, it's exactly like a gymnast or any athlete or sportsman, straining his muscles in order to cultivate more strength. It's not because you're weak to start with. So an understanding of karma based on scientific principles. What better example than Le Chatelier's law of chemistry, that any system in dynamic equilibrium, if disturbed, will take on a new equilibrium position, but in that transition process will either take in heat, endothermic, or exothermic, give out heat.
Okay. Well, on that note of chemistry, I mean, I would say that, one of the things that is difficult here in the modern world, when you're dealing with karma or people's soul connection or identity, is the fact that all this is predicated on the fact that you have to take responsibility. You have to take leadership of your own life and responsibility for what you do. And we live in an incredibly difficult world where people, don't take this responsibility at all for themselves collectively and in all sorts of ways. Of course, some people do, but by and large, the group mind says, oh, you don't have to take responsibility. You can become a victim instead. That's much better. You can get some compensation, get people to feel sorry for you and all the rest of it. And this is a really destructive and pernicious attitude, in my opinion.
Highly. With power comes responsibility. With increasing power comes increasing responsibility. But that equation is not being understood at all by all the people who love power and are totally irresponsible with it.
Well, those people who love power, I often ask myself the question, Eddie, how many of these people are soul connected? Because if they were, would they behave in the ways that they do? Would they have such selfish and short-term attitudes? Would they do things which are so at odds with what the people want? No, they wouldn't. So most of them are soulless beings in the sense that they're not soul connected.
I completely agree with you, Tim. And I think here, just coming back to the wider perspective on the benefits that science is bringing to us, the deep studies that are going on in into near-death experiences that are showing increasingly that people who've had a genuine near-death experience have radically altered their approach to life. And from being selfish and materialistic and all the rest of it, have turned to religion or philosophy or some other compassionate pursuit. And only the other day I was reading about a BBC World Service interview with a gentleman called Kai Hoss. Now, if I tell you that his grandfather was Rudolf Hoss.
Commandant of Auschwitz.
Exactly so. And of course, grandson only knew about that in a school lesson. I mean, the family just kept it quiet, of course. But the point of it is this, that Kai, the grandson, is running a successful hotel business, but then he had a near-death epiphany. And then, as a result of that, he turned to the Bible and became a pastor, and now has 4 sons. And this is the point I'm making, that the NDE seems to connect someone with the higher self, with the soul. Obviously, it doesn't happen to, an NDE is not going to happen to everyone, but I would suggest that the Theosophical teachings will present this idea to you without the benefit of you having an NDE. So why adopt the hard way when there is a soft way of coming to the same realization?
And of course, these NDEs have become much more common in recent decades because of vast improvements in medical science, and because people are able to be kept alive longer after surgery or accidents or
and communication, and the communication of it.
Yes. One of the things that interests me about these NDEs, Eddie, when I've been researching them, is the commonality of the experience, how you get certain distinct features which seem to appear in many of these NDEs, no matter what your religion, your social background, your culture. It seems to be transcultural, all this, but there seems to be a common thread running through many of these. And as you say, most people come out of them, not everyone, but certainly the vast majority come out of them with no fear of death anymore. And indeed, there are cases where people who've been undergoing an NDE are told, right, it's your time to go back. And they say, no, I don't want to go back there. I prefer to stay here. It's much nicer, much more pleasant than, Earth school. So no, it's not your time to be here. You have to go back, etc., etc. And it does have this very, very profound effect on people. And certainly, I mean, there are a lot of TV programs about this now. So it is something that's really getting into the common consciousness. I mean, when Anne Kelly and I were doing our death show, we found that there was a lot of interest in near-death experiences and a lot of podcasts dealing with all this. So it's one of those topics that's very much coming into popular consciousness, isn't it?
Most certainly. And I would like to suggest that it's not coincidental. There is a time and place for these things. And maybe there is a higher consciousness that is opening a valve, a spiritual valve somewhere, for this new flood of insight to come into the consciousness of humanity. Because why is it happening now, over the just last 5 or 10 years, in such a flood?
It does seem clear that new energies from wherever are being released onto the world, and whether this is to do with the transition from the Piscean to the Aquarian age, whether it's to do with the precession of the equinoxes, whether it's to do with other forces from Shambhala or wherever they might be from. I think it is clear that a new energy is being released on the world. And this, coupled with the cyclic transition times, is manifesting in terms of trouble, turmoil. But perhaps if we're to be optimistic about this, we have to believe that there is something greater, something much more powerful and something much more beneficent going on, a spiritual awakening. Am I being over-optimistic in that?
No, not at all. I think you're being very realistic. Because, again, what you're saying has been corroborated and said in different ways by some of the world's greatest uplifters of humanity and compassionate individuals. And the one that comes to mind is Florence Nightingale. And there was a wonderful article in Esoterica about this great lady, and where she openly stated that she said the universe is run by the laws of science, but they are underpinned by a higher intelligence.
I think this is something that's, difficult for people to understand, this notion of a higher intelligence, because people tend to see it through one of two prisms, either the prism of religion or the prism of science. And this tends to color people's view of it and give them, anthropomorphized views of what God is, as some bearded man on a throne somewhere. So I think it's a question of redefining terminology, because obviously terminology is very, very important. The language we use to communicate something is very, very important. And it's almost like we need a new language to explain these things, because a lot of the words that we use, like spirituality or soul or spirit, they mean very different things to different people, don't they? There's no kind of universal acceptance of what they mean as words.
No, there isn't. And the minute you break into Sanskrit, you've lost most of your audience. But I think the way out, however imperfect, is not just to define your terms, but to explain your terms at different levels and in context.
Yes, I think that the ways of communicating these things are very, very interesting. Recently, I've been researching as part of a talk and an article, the mystery schools of the ancient world in Babylon, Greece, Egypt, Americas, China, everywhere, and the possible re-emergence of these in the future. And I think that this is what is going to happen. I'm not saying that these things are going to replace religion, because they certainly won't. Religion's here for a long time to come. But I do believe, and many people have speculated about the re-emergence of these mystery schools, possibly in some of the same locations where they existed in the past, including the British Isles. Do you think this is something on the agenda?
Yes, it is, because the mystery schools, well, they never be extinguished or exterminated, obviously. But I think these powerful forces are dormant. And when the time for awakening comes, they will re-emerge. And I'm thinking of the last chapter of Paul Bronton's In Search of Secret Egypt, where he meets an adept, and the adept tells him that they are still in Egypt, and this is in 1930s, there's still adepts who are in an advanced state of sleeping. What's the word when you're in a very advanced deep
hibernation?
Sleep?
Hibernation.
Hibernation, yeah. And when the time is right, they will re-emerge and reawaken. So this is a distinct possibility. And it doesn't have to be individuals, I think, Tim, as such. It can be ideas that are in hibernation that will emerge when the time is right. And there is a YouTube I was watching on Carl Jung's near-death experience, and the letter he wrote, which he kept very, very private because he thought the world was not ready to read this. So these ideas are in hibernation or animated suspension until the time is right for them to re-emerge.
Yes, of course, when the Theosophical Society was formed exactly 150 years ago this year, there were certain senior adepts in India who were very wary about releasing these ideas and this wisdom on a West that they believed wasn't ready to absorb this stuff yet.
Oh, yes, and there lies a tale. I mean, it was certainly not a total agreement, from my understanding, in the Adept Council of Elders. I recall a famous saying, yes, others thought, some agreed, others thought otherwise. And from what their recollection was, the ones who disagreed with releasing this information were the wiser ones, because the world was not yet prepared. But they thought that if the world were even intellectually ready, let alone intuitionally ready, some ground could be made. Well, is the world even intellectually prepared? How intellectually prepared is the world at large if the vast majority of people think the brain generates consciousness?
Well, this shows how a flawed but pervasive idea can become the truth, even though it's not the truth, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And so
Mm.
the priority now, I suppose, is to overturn that particular view. And you're trying to do that. Other people are trying to do it as well. But it's a very, very slow process. And because the number of scientists, I read the other day somewhere that there are more scientists working in the world today than the accumulated number of scientists throughout history. I don't know if that is true or not. Yeah, or something similar. I mean, there are a great number of scientists. And obviously, you do get a herd mentality in any profession, don't you, where you have to conform. I mean, in journalism, I worked in journalism for more than 50 years, and there is a hive mind in journalism. This is news, that's not news. We can say this, can't say that.
Yes.
And so it's very difficult to break down these very ossified forms of mentality, isn't it?
It certainly is, yes.
Yeah.
And there is most certainly a herd mentality. And as Ian McGilchrist puts it very succinctly, that science is now practiced factory fashion, as in an industry, that any scientist who dares to step out of line will find his career on the rocks. And even a senior scientist who steps out of line still has much to lose. So again, you don't sort of batter the fortress, but you go around it, Battle of Waterloo approach, and the noetic sciences, that wonderful institution, the Galileo Commission of the Scientific Medical Network, all of these sincere groups are doing just this, showing not that science needs to be ejected, which is obviously idiotic, but transcended, or the current model of science needs to be transcended. We're not castigating materialism in its rightful context. That's very important. But we're saying that materialism used to explain the deeper aspects of life and consciousness is just, as Bernardo Castro put it, materialism is baloney.
So we're told, Eddie, there is a grand plan for the evolution of humanity through the various root races and sub races and rounds and chains and all the stuff that people don't want to talk about, rightly so, perhaps. Do you believe that grand plan exists? And if it does exist, are we still on target, or are we somewhere behind? Or are we somewhere even ahead? Because I've heard people suggest that humanity is ahead of where it should be. But I don't know. It's above my pay grade, but perhaps not above yours.
Well, it's certainly above mine, but I certainly do believe there is a grand plan, most certainly. The target area better be very large. But if you think of a game of darts where the target with the bullseye, very few people will aim at the center. A few people will aim towards the center, and some will aim around the circumference. And the ones who are on the circumference are learning to aim rather more accurately. So I most certainly and sincerely believe there is a grand plan of evolution through the various vehicles of consciousness, be they the human body or the root races or the various rounds, all of which are part of nature's grand plan to realize who we are.
Well, on that panoramic note, I think we'll draw that to a conclusion. But thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much to Eddie, and thank you to all of you. Have a good week, everybody, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.